All right, what is going on, everybody? This is the Parallax Viewer, and we're back at it again with an amazing episode. As you've been noticing, keeping up with the channel, I've been doing a lot more exegesis on the Ecrits of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. I'm currently going through the subversion of the subject in conjunction with laying out the graphs of desire, which has been a really fun project. And today I'm doing something that's really spontaneous and out of the blue with a fellow friend of mine. We're doing a cool collab on the mirror stage essay entitled "The Mirror Stage as Formative of the I Function as Revealed in Psychoanalytic Experience," a very popular, but in my opinion, also the most misunderstood essay, and also the most neglected because um, it's always like labeled as, oh, that's just purely Lacan of the imaginary. He didn't develop the real or like the symbolic, and I just think that's total like rubbish. And also, if anybody says that, to use a Zizek'ian joke, that's anti-communist propaganda. It's fascist. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest and friend of the show, Neeshee Pandit, who's a practicing clinician. And I also met him on Instagram a few months ago. And so we've been in correspondence back and forth. So yeah, introduce yourself if you want and tell us a little bit about you before we start.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Andrew. This is going to be interesting, and I totally agree with everything you just said. I'm Nishi. I'm a practicing psychoanalyst, acupuncturist, astrologer, person generally practicing Asian medical systems, and my interest is very much in the intersection between medicine, especially like Asian medicine and psychoanalysis, East and West, Eastern philosophy with like psychoanalysis. So that's like a basic sense of what I'm up to.
Yeah, and I really like that too because we're talking about it prior to recording that we both have an interest in Eastern philosophy, and I don't really explore like um publicly explore it as much with my like work. It's more of like a personal thing.
Hmm.
Spiritually, I'm a Catholic, baptized Catholic, but I have a love for like Buddhism, Zen, and Taoism specifically. And I do think that it's always great to see Lacan exploring Zen koans. But I do also have a love for like the Indian tradition, like Samkhya, Advaita Vedanta, and then like the non-dualist. And one of the texts that I thought like was profound, like when I first started getting into philosophy at the age of 16, as the Upanishads, and it will always be one of my favorite
Yes.
books.
Well,
But
we're gonna come back to the Upanishads at the
yeah,
mirror stage.
oh yeah, we should definitely, yeah. But what I like about like your background is that you're also not afraid to explore the intersections between the two, because like maybe some like staunch Lacanians that are more secular will be like, oh, like not at all. But I do think in a sort of not, because there's, again, we talked about the problems of depth psychology and Jungianism. I do
Hmm.
think there is a sort of holistic, to use your term, medicine. There's a holistic, in a unique way, a holistic approach to Lacan's theory of language and how it relates to the body. And again, psychoanalysis is not only like a practice and a discourse, but it has therapeutic effects. And in a sense, it's aligned with, you could say, the pharmacon,
Totally.
and of course, Freud was a physician. He was a medical doctor. And I think in a sense, like Lacan's exploration of jouissance in the body
Mm.
also relates to like the Freud that he really likes the most, and that Freud that I like the most is Freud of Project for Scientific Psychology, whereas I do
Mm.
the neuron and the nervous system is aligned with like nervous energy and excitation, and not like the neuron of cognitive science, right? Of the
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think, like Freud laid out in the question of lay analysis, he already presents psychoanalysis as an inherently interdisciplinary phenomenon that he even is proposing that it's a linking factor between disparate fields of knowledge. And of course it would be. This is like the phenomenology of the unconscious. So I think you're absolutely right. Um, and Lacan is definitely reviving that on so many levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, just to pivot the conversation to this essay, it's really good to return to it because like a few years ago, my colleague and I on the Vanishing Mediators channel, we explored seminars 1 and 2, and we actually are finishing up 3. And
Mm.
so it's really good to go back to this essay in light of finishing like the first 3 early seminars, which he's always expanding on the importance of the mirror stage. But yeah, like what were your thoughts on reading this essay? What would you like to start off with? Regards
Well,
to
I think, there's a lot I can say, but to start off, I thought of the mirror stage for our conversation because people often ask me, like, where do I start with Lacan? And that's a difficult question because there's like really no easy entry point, to be honest. You just kind of have to dive in and like get into it. But it occurred to me, like, the mirror stage actually is the best place to start with Lacan because it is the foundation of everything that he talks about. And I think the more you read him, the more you explore the seminars, and then you go back to the mirror stage, you realize, oh my gosh, like it's all laid out in the mirror stage, I think. And that's why I would agree with what you said. It's not just the Lacan of the imaginary. In fact, the whole structure of the three registers is implied in the mirror stage essay.
Yeah, and especially this one that's published in the Ecrits, if you have the standard edition and English translation by Bruce Fink. The one that is published in here is from 1949, which is actually an expanded upon version of his original one, which I think it was 1936 or 38 when it was originally
36, right.
36. And he actually historical moment, like he gives it at one of, I think, the IPA congresses in front of a bunch of people, including the head at the time, or one of the heads, which was Ernest Jones. And
Right.
like in the middle of like, I think like the first 3 minutes of like presenting it, he's like, "Get off the stage now. Get off. You're done." Like,
Right. He's interrupted.
yeah. And then right there, you see like Lacan's like Lacan becomes like infuriated with the IPA, and also like Ernest Jones becomes like the main op, for lack of a better term.
That's right. He takes a stab at him in
Yeah, yeah,
presentation
no,
on psychical causality.
yeah, no, absolutely. But I think like, yeah, you're kind of like, for me, I would do the opposite and not do the mirror stage. I would just say like read the seminars, like start with one. But
Totally. You
what
could.
I think my approach is always like read Freud while you read Lacan, because if
Totally.
you read Lacan on your own, you're definitely going to get lost. But also you forget that he's returning to Freud, but for you
Mm-hmm.
know a specific reason, to teach us what exactly Freud discovered and what Freud was trying to develop in
Mm-hmm.
practice. And so I think in my development as like a young Lacanian is to read the Cree essays alongside and not ditch one over the other. But I'm
Totally.
always like, okay, read seminar one, read these specific essays from Freud. Like, don't just buy Interpretation of Dreams at Barnes Nobles. Like, don't
Right.
don't feel
Right.
like these texts. Like, read his essays. And we'll talk about one that relates to this essay. But then also read Function and Field, and then read the Mirror Stage, because Function and Field
Totally.
is so important. Because
But I
now,
also think of the mirror stage as like establishing Lacan's critique of ego psychology and making
absolutely.
it very clear, like where he stands is to point out that the I construction is the formative error, you know?
Mhm,
It's like
mhm.
this is huge. I mean, because Jung's made a whole psychology out of glorifying like the position of ego psychology, you know?
Yeah, yeah, in the weird way, like he does, because I mean, for him, like it's still the same logic, even if the content is different, the form's still the same. Like he wants to make the unconscious conscious, and he
Right.
wants like a healthy, developed imago,
Correct.
as well as like personality, right? So you have the ego, and then you have its other ulterior form, which
Mm-hmm.
is the shadow. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but the idea of the unconscious is sort of an imaginarized form of what the Freudian unconscious is. But we'll get into that too. Like, I think one of the main things I just said, like the imago, is like important because, like, again, what is this? What is this essay really exemplifying? But the importance of the development of narcissism, which comes from Freud in his essay
Mm-hmm.
from 1915, which surprisingly, like like earlier, we were talking about paranoia and psychosis, and as early as Lacan, this was offline, but it's funny how in this early essay, he's doing it in the background of his inquiry in psychosis and paranoia.
Yes.
And what was
Yeah.
Freud doing when he developed the theory of narcissism? He was responding back to many interlocutors, but including Jung, on the problem of libido in psychosis and schizophrenia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
I find that sort of interesting, that there's the same dynamic at play with Freud and Lacan. Um, but this importance of the imago, and I want your thoughts on this, is that he starts off like kind of like similar trajectory with Freud. Freud looking
Mm-hmm.
at like a sort of biological development of his time, like the biological sciences, and for Lacan, he's doing that and looking at like child development theorists,
Right.
zoology. And the emphasis of this image is something that mostly all animals do have. They lure this, they're captivated by this gestalt, this image of a lure, or that image that has a luring effect for the purpose of mating or the
Mm-hmm.
purpose of avoiding danger, right? And he talks about how like the chimpanzees have this utilization of this image synonymous with what we call the mirror stage, but it's only for, again, an instinctual function to repropagate the species, but also for apes they use tools, so it helps as like a sort of tool. But for us it is like our only tool. It's like we don't develop the mirror stage, or uh we don't invest narcissistically into this image out of instinct, but we could say out of a libidinal effect, because we're different, according to Freud, because we have libidinal drives versus animal instincts, right?
Correct.
That's what Lacan wants to point at in talking about like these different stage developments in other scientific inquiries. It's like, okay, yeah, we have this uh, analysis of childhood development where kids are looking at themselves in the mirror and acknowledging the image, but they're not accounting for the psychoanalytic
Mhm.
concept of narcissism and of the ego that becomes important for us.
Totally. And so I think it's fascinating that Lacan starts with this whole thing about the animals, because what is he getting at? He's getting at the fact of what he calls the specific prematurity of birth. Why do humans, of all of the creature, all of the mammalian species, have a specific prematurity of birth? Because we don't have motor coordination when we come out of the womb. And so Lacan is saying that here's the human being standing before the mirror, the infant, stands before the mirror, is not yet an orthopedic totality, is not yet motor coordinated, and yet triumphantly assumes a libidinal investment in its own specular image, which is actually the first other that is experienced by it, right? So this is the whole origin of Lacan's thing, that, the unconscious is the message of the other, that, we're actually like, it's all about subject object relation. So we're already in a subject object relation through the specular image. And he's pointing out that the child like moves its body and like tries to ascertain like the spatial limits, of this lure of identification. And so this is a mirror stage. Now we have basically the structure of Narcissus is right here. This is the Narcissus myth, like placed into the context of human development. That's how I see it.
No, that's perfect. And the point about like not having any like motor coordination, like he does emphasize, I think in this essay as well as like in seminar one, that well, it serves a biological or physiological function, and that like it becomes in this Narcissus myth, as he pointed out, false mastery over oneself in the body. And there is some coordination because like I think when he even investigates like in seminar one, was it the wolf child, and I've heard many things like it's child psychosis. Then I heard like Leon Brenner, another Lacanian, say that it's a form of autism. But
Mm-hmm.
like we see the lack of coordination and motility of his own body, right?
Right.
And so like with the mirror stage, we get this investment of image, and this image of that's a misrecognition of oneself taken onto the body allows for a false sense of unity, right? I use the term like inverted totality, not that there
Right.
was like a reality before this. Is like, no, this is a moment of like a construction of reality. And to bring it back to zoology, I know I forget his full name, but a German zoologist and I think philosopher of nature, Uxküll, is someone that Lacan is influenced by, who develops this idea of the Umwelt and Innenwelt, and these are like
Mm-hmm.
that he uses in this essay.
Right.
So you have like external reality, reality out there, um, but then the development of the organism's life world encapsulates this distinction between inside and outside. So the Umwelt is the sort of outer world of the animal habitat. It's not just external reality, it's reality for the organism to be able
Mm-hmm.
to propagate. And we could see this for the human species as sort of related to reality principle or symbolic reality, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is distinction from just like externality in itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Innenwelt is the interiority, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
also becomes important for us in regards with the narcissistic image. this
Mm-hmm.
positing reality onto our own body, and we take that as like the centerpiece, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so there is even this like jouissance already in the lure of the spatial of the specular image, right? The child enjoys like, but he uses these words like jubilant, you know, it's like a
Mhm.
jubilant assumption, right? It's triumphant and like there's all this enjoyment, but the imago, like he talks
Mhm.
about the imago, so you were right to bring that up early, you know. It's the imago of the fragmented body. In other words, despite the fact that the specular image appears to show you a total body, the actual inversion of that, you know, what is actually experienced by the infant is the sense of a fragmented body, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's also like in regards to the imago. Um, I think you mentioned this earlier, but it's the first form of identification, if I'm not mistaken, because he says right here on page 76,
Mm-hmm.
it's underlined. It suffices to understand that the mirror stage in this context as an identification, it says in the full sense of analysis gives to the term, namely the transformation that takes place in the subject when he assumes an image. And so I think that's like important within that mirror stage in that mythic moment. And again, I like
Mm-hmm.
the term myth because like I think there's this like a common trope in Lacanians to point this out that like drives have a mythic thing. And if we're thinking about libido, and narcissism not as like a biological development, but a libidinal frame, then
Mm-hmm.
like there's like this mythic moment of libido and the drives that to use a term in Freud, the damning of libido. This is what's happening in narcissism. It's a damning of libido, which connects into what we call the ego, uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which we'll probably get into the distinction between how Freud sees this versus Lacan, because I do think there's a difference um, in the way that it's situated. But like to continue on, he says an image is seemingly predestined to have an effect at this phase, as witnessed by the use in analytic theory, the imago, right? And I think this is right here the point in which like when we look at this from, I want to hear your thoughts, like from diagnostic or the diagnostic categories of structures, like the distinction between psychosis and neurosis. And if you be
Mm-hmm.
the graphic desire stuff, like this moment, then retroactively for the neurotic will become the ideal ego, in which like they want to attain this like moment where there used to be this Edenic bliss or this wholeness,
Mm-hmm.
versus what happens later on with the development of ego ideal, right? So you have
Mm-hmm.
like the initial imago, the initial lure, this imaginary frame of mastery. And in seminar one, he has this idea of the optical schema to elaborate the structural dynamic, not a developmental dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
That like what makes this thing also um, a form of misrecognition and a form of false mastery is the fact that it's fragmented, and it also is frustrating because when he uses the example of inverted totality, the term I kind of use, but like the thing about like the optical schema or the inverted bouquet, right? When you invert the bouquet with that oscillating concave mirror, you have the reality of a real image, but it's constantly temporal, right?
Right.
So it's like the sustainment of the other in language and one's position in that is what allows that virtual image to sustain in its absence. And I think that's where like he develops this idea of the symbolic and ego
Right.
ideal, which it's like the time factor where I will be in the future versus where I am now, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically there's like a spatio-temporal complex that is
Yeah.
associated with the mirror stage. You know, it's a structural issue. It's also a temporal issue, and I think he gets more into that in the presentation on psychical causality. You know, this issue of
Yeah.
like how do we understand like the temporal phenomenon, you know, of the mirror stage even, and especially in relation to psychosis because he's rejecting organicism, you know. He's saying organicism, like all this is not an adequate explanation for the phenomenon of like paranoid psychosis. And it struck me actually when I was looking back on this essay, also on page 76, where just before the paragraph you read, Lacan says, referring to the mirror stage, in my view, this activity has a specific meaning up to the age of 18 months and reveals both a libidinal dynamism that has hitherto remained problematic and an ontological structure of the human world that fits in with my reflections on paranoid knowledge. So again,
Yeah.
like it's that scotophilic drive, like the desire to see and to be seen, is like as soon as there's an other, like that statement from the Upanishads is wherever there is an other, fear arises. This
Hmm.
is in some sense the structure of paranoia. You
Hmm.
know? Like
Right. And this idea of paranoid knowledge is so interesting because like he also ascribes like science to a sense have a sort of paranoid quality,
right.
investigation of knowledge. But even like with the way paranoid knowledge and I think he even says in seminar 3 that there is a paranoid structure to the ego itself,
Correct.
which yeah, like it's always this like lore that I'm caught up in, but it's this image that is sort of identified with the image of the other because it is a prior form of alienation, right?
Right. So it's like even the very phenomenon of the other is already a reinforcement of the fact that I'm looking at myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the mirror stage every time I'm in front of someone, in a
Yeah,
sense, you know?
yeah, yeah. And in a neurotic way, you could kind of fill in the blanks of like, oh, did I say something that was stupid? And there was like a paranoid quality to it, but I think paranoid knowledge and the structure that he's talking about is
Mm.
more a sense of like a loss of reality. If that's
Right.
too I don't know if it's too crude to say, but it's like there's something about being taken away or even being invaded, right?
Mm.
In the frame of the other. And I think with the intricacies of understanding the imaginary, this other quality uh kind of relates to, but it's not equivocal to, but it's this idea of transitivism
Right.
that he always talks about.
Yep.
He gives an example of like uh what is it like seeing hitting somebody on the face and you say ow, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the little kid that hits somebody and it's like ow, right?
Right.
They
That
hit me,
it's
right?
not clear like
Right.
where is the locus of the
Yeah.
subject, right? It's not clear yet. It's not differentiated. There's this like fusion still, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so like I brought up earlier the distinction between Freud and Lacan on this. So like
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned narcissism. So what exactly is it that we could unpack that? You mentioned like it's myth, right? And I think that's exactly what Freud does. And given like the intricacies of this essay, Freud is at a debate with Jung regarding the status of libido, and he sees
Right.
libido as sexual,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Jung sees it as like a psychic investment in which there's this idea of called introversion,
Mm-hmm.
right? In which like it
Mm-hmm.
aims at psychic transformation, not
Mm-hmm.
sexual. And of course, he has to like straw man the theory of sexuality in Freud. Um,
Correct.
yeah, but like for Freud, right, narcissism is also an answer to this division between his early 1905 essay, three essays on the theory of sexuality,
Mm.
of autoerotism and
Right.
object love, right?
Mm-hmm.
And autoerotism is like always like this sort of polymorphous thing in which we have these moments of mapping like this erotic zones onto the body. And in my opinion, the way I read it, I feel like in the sense it's like it's never a whole body. It's always like these sort of fragmented moments of like enjoyment in a masturbatory sense. Like when he talks
Mm-hmm.
about like the sucking of the thumb, like the sort of sensation on the anal rectum, all these different
Mm-hmm.
things, but it's like not like sort of fixed or consistent. And I think like this transition of like how we go from there to object love, in which which love becomes the object of libido, right? I think it's
Mm-hmm.
because we have this middle ground or this middle structure of narcissism, which becomes taking the body, as he says, as one's image or as one's object, which I should distinguish that because we've been using imago and image. This is this distinction, in my opinion. I don't know if you agree between Freud and Lacan. Freud, narcissism is taking one's body as an object of satisfaction.
Mm.
For Lacan, it's the specular investment of the image, right?
Mm-hmm.
The image
Mm-hmm.
of the other versus object, right? And I think that solves also the problem of the dualism in Freud, of the distinction between libido drives or libido instincts in the Strachey translation versus ego libido or ego instincts, the satisfaction of sexual excitation or the
Mm-hmm.
self-preservation of life, right, on the level of the ego.
Right. And I think I think you're right to point out that although Lacan is a return to Freud in every sense of that, he also does resolve a lot of things in Freud, that are left not quite as developed as he makes them. Like with the mirror stage, the way he's presenting the phenomenon of the ego, that is not as clearly laid out in Freud. Not with this level of like precision, like to point out that I function like this, so directly. Um, and so I think that, yeah, to your question, it's like, what is the difference there? And I think something here evokes for me Lacan's concept of desire. You're right. Like at the imago is the narcissistic phenomenon here. It's like the experience of the image of the fragmented body. The actual enjoyment of the body comes from desire, like the way that Lacan uses the word desire. And then, of course, the link between that and jouissance, is huge. The way we don't see this as much in Freud, like that clearly. And that's why I think this whole like libidinal argument between Freud and Jung, it's like it, Lacan kind of resolves that for me by being able to describe like the nature of the specular image, the fact that there's a libidinal investment in it. On top of that, like how that gives rise to the symbolic order of language, and then lack, the fact that lack somehow constitutes jouissance, and the symptom, right? So, I mean, I think it's just there's so much nuance to this now. All of a sudden, like the concept of libido is not so simple as erogenous zones. It's not as simple as saying it's just psychic energy, And I think if Jung had accepted more of the Oedipal complex, and Freud's theory of sexuality, his philosophy wouldn't have become as problematic as it became. Which I'm seeing it that way. It's problematic.
But that's a good point. I mean, you're saying so much, but like just to that last point that you ended on, like because Lacan gives actually like a good he gives some props to Jung by saying like, we got to thank Jung for actually developing the theory of the complex far
Right.
more than Freud did. But in a sense, it's like I think the complex that really matters most is the logic that it ensues with the Oedipus complex, right?
Yes.
This mythic one that has to do with the development of you know all the things that we're familiar with in psychoanalytic theory, like the phallus, the name of the father,
Mm-hmm.
castration,
Mm-hmm.
frustration, etc. Versus like I don't know, like you got like all these different mythic complexes like in Freud or like in Jung, and it seems to like go everywhere. And I honestly think like I heard this from someone. I think it was I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Downs, The Dangerous Maybe.
I don't
Um,
think so.
okay, yeah, he's a good friend of mine. He's writing this book on like land and Zizek, like a debate, but he's also influenced by Lacan and to some extent. But he said, I think he's quoting this from Adrian Johnston. Adrian Johnston said that if anything, Jung kind of psychoticizes the unconscious in an extreme form.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. All
with
these
all these
archetypes, all these images you could say are
right.
derived from the specular image to begin with.
Exactly, right. And so
Right?
like because even the archetypes themselves comes from this term imago that in,
Yes.
in his analytical psychology, there are a bunch of lectures he gave in Zurich. He he says like, I coined this term archetype, which derives as early from the Latin imago, and he's using it in the sense that Saint Augustine meant like as the image, right? And so, like
Mm-hmm.
these archetypes of the unconscious, these imagos contain with them like a complex to sort of integrate itself, right, into the
Right.
ego, right?
Right.
So it's like in a sense you say like he kind of like brings back ego psychology in a more weird form than like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
strengthening the defenses, right?
Right. So my question
Integrating,
is, where does this take us?
yeah,
Where does it take us? Like the integration with the archetypes with more specular fantasies, where is this going to take us? It doesn't take us to the real, which again is Lacan's aim, I would say, all of the time, is to bring forward that imposition, which can't be fully formulated even, hence all of the mathemes and so forth, the topologies.
right. And it brings up the good point about the nature and the status of the ego, right? Is that it is what he will term from Freud the pathogenic nucleus and also the most privileged symptom, right?
Mm,
It's not like something that like we need to like make better though. It's like something that like doesn't work. And so like I guess to kind of pick your brain,
mm-hmm.
as we mentioned neurosis and psychosis, like how do you see the mirror stage function uh and the imago in a relationship between neurosis and psychosis? Because I kind of preluded a bit to like the ego ideal and ideal ego in neurotic.
Right. Right.
He does mention something that is distinct in of like the imago and the mirror stage with psychosis and neurosis, right?
Right. In a way, I kind of feel like psychosis is still in the most fundamental form of the mirror stage. You know, it's like the sense of the double, right? And the double experienced invasively, paranoically, right? There is a kind of a gnosis in the mirror stage, but it's a gnosis that infects someone, right? It's infectious, and that's why in Seminar 3, Lacan says like speech is a parasite, speech is the cancer. You know, again, he's talking about psychosis and how evident it is that in some ways our endowment with speech, the fact that we're speaking bodies, is in some ways like predicated on this, on the fact of the mirror state, on the fact of the specular image, you know? And then so with neurosis, you have a more complex form of that. It develops language, it develops facility for repression through language, you know? It's able to receive the message of the other in an inverted form, you know? All of this can go on. There can be all these ellipses, you know, in the discourse of the neurotic. But in psychosis, everything's wide open, you know? We have not yet performed a suture that would allow us to stitch like the gap, the actual alienating tension that is in the mirror stage is left raw, basically. This is what makes psychosis so fascinating, why Lacan was correct to look at it and say, wow, this is not this is not necessarily like something that is pathological in the way we're thinking. It actually constitutes a form of gnosis, paranoid knowledge, you know?
This is such a good point, and I can't help but think of something that he says about the obsessional neurotic. It's like in the third lesson of Seminar 4. What is this obsessional neurotic? But like, someone who has these sort of ritualistic performances. I'm paraphrasing, but like these ritualistic performances that they try to enact with their alter ego through the gaze of the other, right? Other
Mm-hmm.
capital O, right?
Mm-hmm.
Only to sort of like undermine them and to repeat again and not realize what their entire aim is. And even
Mm-hmm.
if they do know it, they have to sort of distance themselves. And we could substitute the word aim for desire.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, for the psychotic, as you're saying, there's just like this openness to it. They haven't sutured. And there's just sort of this openness allows for this gnosis, as you said, this paranoid gnosis, that they have this in-depth knowledge that's so open to them and it's also so overwhelming. I
Mm-hmm.
and we've mentioned sexuality, we mentioned libido, investment, eroticism, but we have to account for, as because you referenced Seminar 3, what he also mentions about this um, structure of narcissism is the oscillation between eroticism of the imaginary allure and aggressivity,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And two examples you have, and I love when he always uses examples with animals in zoology.
Mm-hmm.
He
Yes.
uses if you remember the stickleback fish, right? It's
Right.
a few like predatorial fishes out there. And like when it's attacking, it flares its up, like it has like these like spikes on the back and it flares it up. And
Mm-hmm.
then like when it does a mating ritual, it like digs holes into the ground and does this like weird dance when it's about to mate. But if you put a glass, like a beer bottle, in front of it and it looks at its own image, it doesn't know what to do. It's
Mm-hmm.
like in this oscillation between, should I attack or should I create like this ritualistic lure for the propagation of my species, right? And so this
Mm-hmm.
is something which like confuses with this lure, this oscillation between um, aggressivity on the one hand and eroticization. But I think in an erotic, because of repression, there's a fine line between that. Although we do see when that erodes in imaginary rivalry and like sort of this paternalistic mode of enjoyment, we do have forms of jealousy, right?
Yes.
Like for instance, his classic example that Zizek uses is like the pathological jealous husband that believes his wife
Right.
is cheating on him,
Mm-hmm.
and even if he is correct, it's only insofar as that he needs to satisfy his own pathological jealousy, right? So
Right.
in a way, that's almost like a sort of neurotic that's fearful and anxious with using jealousy as a tool. Whereas like for the psychotic, it's almost something different. Uh, I'm not jealous of them because I hate them or something like that. I'm jealous of them because they hate me, right?
For the persecutory.
Persecutory aspect, right? Or the
Yes.
paranoid aspect.
Mm-hmm.
The example again of like Schreiber saying, uh, they think I'm psychotic because I'm always referring to them. But no, it's the fact that he is always referring to me, he who wants to harm me, right? So the way
Mm-hmm.
that in which that it's like put onto the onus of this other that's trying to invade me that I know
Right.
all about, like I find really interesting, right?
Same. And I think that's why Lacan's beautiful statement in Seminar 3 that the psychotic is a martyr of the unconscious, that they have an open testimony, in fact, brings us back to their very legitimate gnosis, even if derived still on an imaginary basis, and then the fact is that in contrast to that, the neurotic has a question, you know. There's a question in neurosis. They're not certain of why they know what they know. There's doubt, but the psychotic knows what they know. They're certain of what they know, even if it is troubling, and invasive and paranoid and like martyring, sacrificial, persecutory. They're certain of the persecution that's taking place. They may even internalize it, voices and so forth, And I think again, the fact that we're talking about neurosis, psychosis, which I've thought a lot about and also just in the clinic, like have watched, observed, listened to, and tried to form my own observations on. And I think the huge point Lacan has made here is to identify them as structures and not as symptoms, because you will see paranoid symptoms in neurotic people. Neurotically structured subjects will also show you paranoid symptoms, Obsessionals will sometimes show you hysterical symptoms too. So it's like, because both are under the structure of neurosis, Why is there paranoia and neurosis as a symptom, not necessarily as a structure, as it is for psychosis? Well, the mirror stage, the very fact of narcissus, the very fact of like encountering your specular image is already paranoiac, right? So again, the mirror stage functions for me as like the core structure of all of the clinical structures, in fact. Like it's the formation, of these structures as something constitutional, constitutive, and pathological.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the martyr of the unconscious. I did write something on that a while back. It's like I think in Seminar 3, that chapter,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like martyr of the unconscious and the signifier and the real. Like
Yeah.
such a really great layout of like the distinction between like um the way the signifier functions in neurosis versus psychosis. Because I think one of the interesting things that like a lot of it, I mean, because like there's so much translation of all these concepts in Lacan, the big other, the
Mm-hmm.
signifier, the name of the father.
Mm-hmm.
And the one of the things that he mentions in the end of that essay and the beginning of the next essay, which I believe is section 11, um, is that I think it's called the signifier and the real and the bellowing miracles.
Yeah.
That it's not that the psychotic doesn't have an unconscious, right? In fact,
Right.
it's there, but it's inoperative, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's what you like kind of pointed out that there is a question in neurotic that they ask but don't want to know the answer to, only
Mm-hmm.
repeat the question, in the enunciation. Um, he uses like a sort of he changes the way in which like Aristotle uses this phrase, man thinks with the soul. And he says like
Right.
man thinks with his ego, but in the form of a neurotic question that he doesn't want to know the answer to.
Right.
But for the psychotic, because their unconscious is an operative, they have no need for the history of castration, right? Because they refuse anything that would constitute repression, right? They reject
Mm-hmm.
in Hippolyte's his response to Hippolyte's commentary on Freud's Verneinung, he says that
Right.
what the psychotic does is a symbolic abolition. Like they abolish anything that would constitute symbolization in itself, right? So in
Mm-hmm.
this moment of identification, in the mirror stage, something could happen that could be traumatic that constitutes an identity. But for repression in neurotic patients, it's like a form of knowledge that they want to repress down, only to ask it as kevoy, right? Whereas
Right.
things like in the psychotic, they want no history of it, so that's why it's replaced by you know psychotic structures of delusions and paranoia. And I guess it brings up the question of the distinction between, because this relates to the mirror stage,
Mm-hmm.
and he mentions in this essay the distinction between primary narcissism and
Mm,
secondary narcissism and how it
right.
relates to these two structures. I mean, we haven't even talked about perversion, but I think it's really appropriate more to talk about the distinction between neurosis and psychosis in this essay.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I think that that's why I've often thought of the analytic situation itself as like a dialectical reversal of the mirror stage in a way, you know? It's like, you have to come into a certain primary narcissism there, to speak in that way as an analysand, And then also you're reenacting through the dyad, the analytic dyad, something of the mirror stage is happening again, but but instead of encountering the specular image, you're encountering yourself at the level of speech, at the level of the signifier. And that's why I think Lacan is so right to talk about the discourse, of the psychotic, the language aspects of it. And like when you listen to a psychotic subject, like the profusion of signifiers is impressive, you know? It's like a true free association, in fact. And you can hear that there is connections between them, but they're not making them. You can make them, but they're not making them. Um, it's fascinating. And so I think that that's why the mirror stage, again, is such an important structural construction because it's something that it endures. It's not just like, I think that could be a mistake people might make, is thinking that, oh, it's just 6 to 18 months, like it's childhood development, then we grow beyond that into what exactly, no, the mirror stage forever marks the destiny, of the individual for Lacan, right? And
Well, I
that
think
yeah, the
I was just
death
gonna
wish is
say,
in there.
yeah. And I was also gonna say too, well, it also brings up like, Freud's later essay, I think 1921, 23, the economic problem of masochism.
Mm,
Yeah. With this, not even just death drive, but this like death wish, this like undermining of oneself, but there's an economic aspect to it,
mm,
like a sadism towards oneself, right? Uh,
right.
but I mean, thinking about what you just said, like, it makes me think like with regards to, we say, this mirror stage thing, that it's just like it's a never ending process. It's not like it's just like between this window of like 8 to 16 months, but rather that it's always going on. And it even shows that, if someone's like structurally psychotic, sometimes they don't have a breakdown until like they're in their like mid 20s or early 30s, or even then, like things go well until like, even if they're 40 or 50 and something happens, like they lose their job, they
Hmm.
go through a insane divorce,
Hmm.
they get arrested, or like for Schreiber, who is a very well known judge, and he also is appointed as president, and it's between that he is able to then well, once he's appointed, he then has his first breakdown, right? I forget
Right.
the entire, it's been a while since I had the memoir, I read the memoir, and then like just finishing this essay on, or this seminar. I forget the exact chronology that Lacan lays out regarding like the different breakdowns, because he's got like more than one. I want to say
Hmm.
there's like three breakdowns in his entire like period of like psychiatric treatment. But it's like the first one has to do with the fact that uh his inability to be a father, because I don't think he's able to procreate. Like there's something wrong where he can't impregnate his wife, and then being appointed as judge, that's when things break down, right? So it's like, I guess what I'm trying to say, and it's like long-winded thing because I was losing my train of thought. Um, that like psychosis, like you won't really have this, like you're not just like at the age of like 10 or 11, it's like you're fully like going through puberty and you're like, okay, now I'm like psychotic. Like, no, something by chance happens, right? That met
Right.
with the arrangement, if you say signify or something like that. And what's
Mhm.
interesting about like what you were saying, like the amount of signifiers or just like speech that comes out of a psychotic patient, there's also no scansion, there's no punctuation. It just keeps
Right.
going. Like it's pure metonymy, right? Compared to
Yes.
neurotic. And even the neurotics will like censor themselves, right?
Correct.
Will also be like, well, I don't know if I should say this. And this also
Yep.
brings up the distinction between verneinung or negation and rejection, right? And always like this like classic example of here, well, I don't mean to be rude, but, or I don't mean to be racist, but there's none of that like in psychotic speech.
Correct. Yeah. I'm gonna share my light on real quick.
Yeah, no worries. But like, I think these are like crucial things to notice because it really is centered around language, right? And
Right.
fire, right? And uh bringing up seminar 3, one of the crucial things, I think this is why the imaginary and the mirror stage is so important for the psychotic, is the
Mm-hmm.
idea of presence and absence, right? It's a signifier endows absence and
By
allows
standing in for another signifier.
exactly in the neurotic. That's why repression is so
Mm-hmm.
pivotal. But there's purely presence of an other that is constantly persecutory, or let's not even talk about persecution. Let's talk about erotomania, right?
Mm.
You know, I don't love him. It's he who loves me, right?
Mm.
And because of that, I have to stalk them every day, right?
Right.
Pure presence of the other.
Exactly. I think this is why Lacan is correct to describe the mirror stage as a drama, that has an internal pressure, right? And that it goes right back to the structure of Narcissus, which is a libidinal investment, right? The idea that this image in the pond is somehow not my own, but like other to me, and I can invest like love into. I love this image. I love it so much that it becomes a form of suicidal aggression, right? This is Lacan's phrase. Suicidal aggression is formed in the mirror stage. Like seeing the specular image it's the martyrdom, is there also, but it's like it's not only martyrdom. Like for the psychotic, it seems more like that the other persecutes them, right? But all of this, including the repression of the neurotic, is a phenomenon of the suicidal aggression of Narcissus, right? Seeing oneself as other is a delusion already. And the fact that Narcissus dies gazing at that image, it's a death wish. It's the love and the hate.
Oh no, and that's good. And this suicidal aggression for the neurotic can take on metaphorical forms,
Right.
symbolic forms. It's never literal.
Right.
Whereas, like for the psychotic, it is literal, but they're not necessarily trying to kill themselves. In
Right.
fact, they may kill the other in attempts to literally kill themselves because of how they're alienated within the specular image of the other, right? Going
Mhm.
back to the transitism thing, like you know, ow, they hit me, right? Or ow,
Mm.
they stabbed me, but that's really the psychotic stabbing their victim.
Right.
And again, this is just an example of how the suicidal aggressivity plays about. But this is not, and we obviously know, but I want like for any viewers that are made new to this and may uh not be as clinically oriented about this stuff, like it doesn't mean that every psychotic person is a murderer. I bring
Right.
this up
Yeah.
because in fact we were talking about this offline. There's a going back to like the relevance historically of this essay, because this was written in 1949 off of its earlier publication in 36, but earlier in that time he was working on this case about these two sisters, the Papin sisters, um, and they were maids for like a petty bourgeois family in France, and they murdered the father and the daughter, and then they ritualistically were cutting up parts of their body, and they were found in the house hugging each other. These two sisters are twins, um, and so like the psychiatrists that they have were seen during their trial. They didn't see any sort of clinical or psychiatric diagnostic. They just thought they were murderers. And mind you, they went through like multiple highly esteemed psychiatrists, according to Lacan. And when Lacan oversees this case, he finds, oh no, there is a form of psychosis and delusion going on. And so they have this phrase about like needing to cut up, like feel, I guess like feeling fragmented. Like from what I read, it's like needing to cut things up, filling into pieces. This wasn't a metaphor. This was literal, like trying to cut them up, but they did it in the form of killing the other, right? And the
Mm.
only way that they could ground their psychotic delusions was by placing their femininity in the gaze of each other because they're twins. So their own femininity was grounded in the specular image of each other as sisters. And once they were separated, the amount of delusions and hallucinations they were experiencing were so twofold after being in separate cells that Lacan's like, oh no, this is a supreme form of psychosis and delusion, and even I think like persecution to the list go
Mm-hmm.
on,
Mm-hmm.
but this is an example. And this is early Lacan before he becomes Lacan that's infamous for giving the seminars.
Right, right. I think, that illustrates right there Lacan's point with the mirror stage that all relations are mirror relations. You know, you see it especially with the twin situation in that, right? And for some reason, and maybe we'll find out why, that evokes for me what he says about the pigeons, right? He brings it up in the mirror stage essay, he brings it up again in the presentation of psychical causality, where he says that the mere sight of another pigeon or even like the image of that pigeon is enough to trigger ovulation, you know? So again, the fact that the specular image provides the opportunity for libidinal investment is absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. And even just going back to the neurotic, right? Whereas like we see how there's a literal destruction of the image via the other in the psychotic. What we see in the neurotic is a form of Oedipal rivalry, right?
Right.
And this takes form in analysis as well, in which the neurotic patient will try to one up the other by conflating the imaginary other with the analyst.
Mm-hmm.
Is why the analyst's job is to situate himself, as he says, as early in his early career, in the position of the big other. Why? So we could see what is going on at the level of the unconscious and not remain in this sort of imaginary rivalry, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this imaginary rivalry, which like in early Lacan, we see terms like intersubjectivity
Mm-hmm.
appear, but it's not because Lacan cares about intersubjectivity, but he's like, this is what has at stake in intersubjectivity, a mirror relation that is never one of equality, but always one of a hidden rivalry and domination, right? That's why
Right.
he's so keen on comparing this to the Hegelian master slave dialectic, right?
Yes, and I was thinking about that yesterday, the master slave, exactly, because in the 1938 piece, The Family Complexes and the Formation of the Individual, this is early Lacan, like this is like, a few years after he wrote his grand doctoral thesis on paranoid psychosis, right? And this is the first time that we really see something in print on the mirror stage. That's to my knowledge, because the 1936 lecture, I don't think we have that. We have this early formation of it in family complexes. And where does it appear? In the context of discussions on jealousy and aggressiveness, right? Even in the Ecrits, we see what comes right after the mirror stage essay, aggressiveness in psychoanalysis, right? So again, I think here we have the fact that Narcissus leads to Oedipus, and I think this may be also the question with psychosis. What has happened in the Oedipal complex, or maybe what hasn't happened in the Oedipal complex, the triangulation, do they constitute that level in the psyche? Because on one level that needs to happen, and then another level we need to go beyond it, like you're pointing out with the rivalry and such. For the neurotic, we can say very clearly they pass through the Oedipal complex quite successfully, maybe too successfully.
That's so good, and that's such a crucial point. Um, I didn't even think about it with like what comes after the mirror stage essay published in the Ecrit, but aggressivity and psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
That's still an early essay, but the main point you made is this triangulation, because that's
Mm-hmm.
what the neurotic is always situating themselves in. This is why it's infantile, and this is why it's Oedipal,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
not to mention that narcissism. Because it's another good point. Narcissism leads to Oedipus. Both are tragedies. And
Yes.
what is the human condition and its symptom? And this is not a pessimism. This is just the reality that psychoanalysis as a practice situates itself in, is the tragedy and the foibles of the human condition
Mm-hmm.
that we nonetheless repeat and enjoy, right? And so psychoanalysis situates itself in not only what doesn't work, but also why is it that you still nevertheless enjoy or try to enjoy or see another enjoy, and you try to place yourself in that position where the other is at, and this is where you undermine yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to go back to this triangulation point, because in neurosis there's that imaginary rivalry, but there's also this triangulation, the the antagonism that the neurotic experiences in the imaginary rivalry with the other, but also trying to get at the other big O's jouissance, or the other's big O's desire, right? So there is another that is desiring and knows how to desire, and they have my desire, or my desire is
Right.
theirs. And they also have knowledge of enjoyment, right?
Mhm.
And funny enough, in seminar 3, he then talks about Dora and hysteria, and her relation is not one of triangulation, but of a quadruplicity, right?
Mm.
So you have Herke, which is a friend of her father, uh,
Mhm.
his wife, Frauke, who Dora's father is having relations with, right? And
Right.
then um, you have Dora herself, and then the alter ego that she wants to situate herself in, which
Mhm.
has to relate to Frauke as a form of femininity,
Mhm.
because apparently he's like the father is trying to like send her off to Herike, and Herike is like trying to sleep with her, or he's prostituting her to him. And then at the same time, the dad is sleeping with Frauke, right? And
Mhm.
Frauke has this privileged position, like what is it to be woman, right? Why is it that she's the center of attention, right? So uh in this like sort of scene of her trying to understand her father's desire and obtain her father's love, she's also trying to position herself in this position of an alter ego of embodying her femininity in a homosexual way. But you know, it's not because she's homosexual, it's because it has to do this question of what does it mean to be a woman, right?
Right.
But in psychosis it's not the same. You have this sort of one-to-one relationship,
Mm.
and if anybody tries to triangulate, that is when there are problems, right? That's where this fear of castration comes in. That becomes not only a fear, but a threat, right?
Mhm.
It's not even anxiety provoking like you see in neurosis and the obsessional.
Mhm.
No, it is an extreme threat of persecution, of being cut up, of being invaded, right?
Mhm.
That's why that example of the what is it? It's Lacan is talking about this case with the woman. It's the famous case that you're probably aware of it. And like she's like with a friend. She used to live with this friend for a long time, and her friend started seeing someone who she is very mistrustful of. And she like walks by him, and there's this sort of remark that he says that may have this sort of ambiguity of being sexual but also threatening. And she replies, "I have been to the butcher," and there's this reply,
Right.
"Now," right?
Wow.
You know, and so like why this is important is because it has to do with this invasion of the other, but not, I guess, the way that I understand this phrase of "I've been to the butcher lately," and
Mhm.
the reply of Sal, it's like a sexual innuendo. Like I know how to
Right.
handle pork, I know how to handle sausage, I know how to handle meat, and that's like
Mhm.
an idiot sexual innuendo for the penis. But in this case, it has nothing to do with that, because in the way she says "sow," Lacan is like pork or pig. No, he says pig, not pork. He says pig. And I apparently like this, like the way he translates this in the seminar, is that this is a misunderstanding on his end, right? Because I
Mhm.
think the misunderstanding of why we shouldn't understand too soon is that he interpreted it in the form of like a neurotic metaphor, but for her it's literal in the way that she assumes that this guy wants to butcher her up like a
Right.
pig, right?
Right. This brings us right to the issue of the triangulation or the lack thereof, the missing third, that there is no third, as you were saying, and the fact that there is something of that Oedipal structure that's needed, and without that, you experience a different structure of relations, right, altogether. And so I think that this is why, I'm critical of Jung for dispensing with like the full significance of the Oedipal complex, because I think like this is not a workable settlement, in favor of like the occult and whatever, which I'm also in favor of the occult. That's fine, but not at the expense of the Oedipal complex. So I think that, yeah, the triangulation, and the fact that there's also like the foreclosure, right? Foreclosure of the father, the foreclosure of the symbolic in the psychotic structure. Like that's the mechanism of it, right? Would also suggest to me that there's something in the Oedipal complex that's not yet achieved. It's like it's foreclosed. It's like you don't get the triangulation. You foreclose the father. You don't, if you repress, it's still there. You can repress the thing, right? You're still triangulated by all the more so, right? But with psychosis, this foreclosure, I think, is like, if we can really understand that mechanism, and it throws us for a loop, especially in psychoanalytic experience because of the language implication, right? And as you were pointing out, I wanted to go back to that master slave dialectic because that's also in the mirror stage, like really strongly. And Lacan uses that phrase, the knot of imaginary servitude. That the more that we have this attempt at mastery of the specular image, the more we find ourselves the slave to this other, who is in fact our own double.
Yeah, and because for Hegel, and I mean his reading of Hegel comes from Kojel's reading of Hegel. This is also like what founds civilization, right?
Yes.
Is this bond and this alienation and the redoubling of myself, but also insofar as that I'm caught up within the other and
Mm-hmm.
knowing myself. There's this mediation, um, and quite frankly, it's also an elaboration of the finding of civilization for Freud, right? And civilization is discontent. Because it's not like we have like neurosis and psychosis outside of civilization. No, it's like because of modern civilization, that there's a sort of cultural malaise, there's a discontent in society, and to use Freudian language, there's this like harshness of reality and the reality principle that it bears like it's hard to bear. And so he
Mm-hmm.
talks about like techniques to deal with the frustration and the dissatisfaction that civilization brings. Religion, of course, is one of those things, but he also deems religion as a sort of attempt of narcissistic Edenic bliss with a sort of paternalistic function of the father mediating things
Mm-hmm.
in monotheism. But then you have art and science as techniques to try to utilize that. But all it will do is only give us promises and momentary satisfaction, only to fill us with more dissatisfaction, malaise, and especially science, because science, Galilean science, modern science, is slowly modernizing, but then also demystifying. I mean, there's still a superstitious or paranoid quality to it, but it also demystifies a lot of the religious conceptions that feudal society or religious society would adhere to bind itself together. But when
Mm-hmm.
that fails, the neurotic symptom is something that we use to try to maintain a sort of prosthetic satisfaction, right? And I feel like psychosis, on the other hand, is a sort of way to try to not just reconcile the impossibility that neurosis can achieve, like it achieves it, it can achieve anything. It's dealing with this impossible desire or an impossible object, but it's like psychosis, on the other hand, is also something that manifests from civilization as discontent, as a way to sort of foreclose or reject anything of that history, right? Um, and I don't see it in the Deleuzian Guattarian sense as something liberating, but of course it could still teach us something. This is why he's obsessed with Joyce and what Joyce is doing with writing. But I think it'd be foolish to see it as something that's like, oh, it's aiming at something like deterritorializing, like something romantic, like and like something like uh liberating and countercultural. Like, no, it's still contingent to modern civilization and the sort of reaction and rejection of that. It's not something that has liberatory effects, nor is it something that we should see as like our natural predisposition, right? I think that's why
Right.
also like with the Reichian Deleuzian dudes, like there's this romanticization of pre-Oedipal infantile sexuality, right?
Right. Right. So I think you said there's a lot in what you just said that's really interesting. There is the fact that civilization, in the family complex essay, Lacan makes it very clear that the family structure is the source of culture. It is the institution at the source of culture. This means that civilization is an Oedipal phenomenon, right? Freud has already pointed, so he's writing on Freud's civilization and its discontents already very clearly, right? Now, the other thing in that this basically makes civilization a virtual reality, right? I don't even want to use that word reality because of Lacan's use of the real, which I want to protect. But it is like a virtual phenomenon, a mirage, right? Through which, as Freud pointed out, we displace, we displace our drives, right? And we use religion and we use like we construct the law of civilization, and it is full of malaise because it has a foundation in malaise. And I think what you said about the psychotic's relationship to civilization was particularly noteworthy because I've also been exploring the relationship between psychosis and spirituality, like holy madness. The fact is that there are similarities in the experience of mysticism, the experience of schizophrenics, and the line between what's pathological and what is actually like truly like, you know, the emergence of the real, is the question at hand. And I think this is why you see the phenomenon of renunciation. Like the psychotic, in a way, cannot achieve a workable settlement with civilization, right? They don't have the repressive mechanism for that. They stand outside of it, almost as like a commentary on it, and they renounce. They renounce civilization in some way, not in a way that's necessarily enlightened, though, as you've pointed out.
Yeah, yeah. They in a sense they're renouncing civilization for like their own like secondary narcissistic delusion, whereas like for Freud, it's like to be in civilization, you have to renounce your own libidinal satisfaction or
Yes.
your own enjoyment, right?
Right.
Um, and like yeah, thinking about this and going back to the essay or the lesson that you mentioned, the martyr of the unconscious. This is why like Lacan will say it's like, well, the psychotic, like they're no different from us. In fact, we actually lived in a shared delusion, because
Mm-hmm.
right after he talks about the martyr of the unconscious, he talks about the distinction between slave society and the discourse of freedom. And he says that in serfdom or slave societies, there's this unconscious desire, demand for liberation, right? And so liberation is embedded within the discourse of the master
Mm-hmm.
and slavery. So you have the distinction between master and slave, but then the contrary to that would be liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we live in what we would call the discourse of freedom, but everything that we account as far as freedom goes, or everything that we like to define freedom on, is everything but freedom, right? It's actually its own obstacle and its own impetus. Freedom of the market, freedom of property, uh, freedom to this and that, but they never quite get a hold on what freedom is. And so he uses this perfect example, like if someone were to come up to me and confide into me and ask whether or not if it's a good idea to get married, I
Mm-hmm.
would withhold that knowledge, not because I think contrary that they're not worthy of marriage, that I don't think that they would be a good husband or wife, and I have a better understanding, like, no, you'd be better at this. It's because I had to put in a question of like what that even is and if that accounts as freedom itself, right?
Right.
And so there is this open-endedness to that. And so we have to like sort of reject that open-ended feeling or subjectivization of it, and in a sense we kind of abandon or resign the real of that, the
Mm-hmm.
real of that like open-endedness of like this discourse of freedom. Because if everything is the sort of contrary to what freedom is, then what is contrary to that, right? It's definitely not slavery, because we're supposed to be in a free society, but everything that we do is the opposite of that. So, what is the sort of difference and contrary that would overcome the discourse of freedom? And that's where psychoanalysis situates itself. And that's why he sees Schreber as an interesting thing, right?
Totally. And I think
Yeah.
that's why also the Jungian concept of individuation and integration does not lead to autonomy, as has been so proposed. It is in fact completely bound up in the knot of imaginary servitude. We all these archetypes, the more you integrate with them and so forth, where is that taking us exactly? Deeper into the mirror stage, like deeper into like the specter. And I think that's why at the very end of the mirror stage, which is one of Lacan is a master of endings, in his writing. Like he knows how to bring the conclusion to an essay with so much power. And the ending to the mirror stage is one of the most powerful moments in his writing. Also in Function and Field, there's an incredible ending where he also cites the Upanishads. There's a citing of the Upanishad in the ending of the mirror stage where he says that psychoanalysis can only accompany the patient to the ecstatic limit of thou art that, right? Which again, the translation of Tattvamasi, which is an Upanishadic Mahavakya, meaning great utterance. It's like that's the real, in a way. Like we can accompany the patient like to the limit of the real is how I interpret that. which is the question of freedom, which is the question of like how do we transcend the confines of this specular image, this double, this virtual relationship we have that now predicates like our entire relational cultural sphere of experience, of existence, right? As a primary malaise. In a way, he's kind of pointing to the fact that something in psychoanalytic experience, is able to accompany the patient to this point, you know?
No, no, this is really good because now I'm thinking about it because I mean, you mentioned the whole thing about mortal destiny and the mirror stage as our mortal destiny.
Mm.
But this point right here, uh, that you read in the quote, like in the subject to subject recourse, we preserve psychoanalysis can accompany the patient to the ecstatic limit of thou art that, right? Thou, which is you, which is also similar because we didn't really touch on this as much. But the name of this essay is the function of the mirror stage and the function of the eye, right? Or the formative, as formative of the function of the eye. The function of the eye is so important because the I as a signifier not only refers to the ego, but it also is a sort of indexical, right? It's a designator, which is
Mm-hmm.
different from the signifier, which represents the subject for another signifier, which would be the unconscious formation. But this I is important because, well, okay, it only designates the fact that it's me that I'm referring to that is speaking, but it doesn't give me any meaning, right? And another indexical or designator is thou, right? Thou art that. But what is that? All I just did was point to point. But what he's
Yes.
getting at is that this is the ecstatic limit, right? That only I can accompany you, but I can't make you say anything. I can't I can lead a horse to water, but I can't make him drink,
Mm-hmm.
to put it bluntly. But this makes me think of this. I shared some pages of Eric Laurent earlier,
Yeah.
the Tao and the letter, but he says this right here about these three reels, and I think that this like kind of so I think this kind of relates to what we're getting at. So he says that the real in science only knows or touches upon it by mathematizable formulas, right, under symbolic form, right, and then in the symptom the symbolic becomes real in the psychoanalytic sense. But then there's another aspect of the real that I think touches on what we're getting at. He says Lacan's idea is that it would be wonderful for psychoanalysis to propose that a certain function of the signified, not of the signifier, gives us a real that is in operating on the effects of sense. We might have a function where the effect of sense touches the real. And I wonder if this thou art that is in a sense touching upon a sense that does have effects. Maybe we
Mm.
relate it to this phrase ecstatic limit, right? Um, because again, it goes back to this thing of like thou art that these two indexicals are designators, right? But
Right.
it puts into question what is being meant or what is being said by thou art that. What is, obviously thou is supposed to be me, but what is that I'm supposed to be,
Right.
right?
This is the good question because thou art that in like Vedantic doctrine is trying to elucidate the non-dual ontology of Atman and Brahman, right? So Atman again takes us back to the I, right? Because it's sort of this sense of an I, but like not necessarily the sense that it's the true nucleus of existence, It's not the specular image conceived 6 to 18 months. Like the Atman is actually like the true functionality of the human being, the fact that you exist at all. Like it's more primordial than what's constructed in the mirror stage. And yet it has this resonance with the idea of self, right? Lowercase s. And then Brahman is also described in the text as self. It's translated in English as capital S, self, right? So in a sense, there is something about this selfness that that's been misrecognized, Lacan would say, right? And so this thou art that is almost it is in some sense Lacan's answer to the dilemma of the mirror stage, is saying like, you're looking in the mirror, that is not what you are, this is not, and this is a misrecognition that begins the misadventure of your entire existence, and if you could come into the limit, you can come to the limit of thou art that, meaning now you have to enter the real, like this is not something that psychoanalysis can only accompany you to in a way. And I think in a way he's describing what the true fulfillment of an analysis would even be, is the fact that you can even take someone to that limit is extraordinary. This is beyond medicine. This is beyond what a medical intervention can do for someone. I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'm actually flipping through the last page of function and field, and it's the Upanishad dialogue of the Deva and man and the Asura, and
Mm-hmm.
it's Prajapati, god of thunder, and then like he's saying thou hast said to us, Damyata, master yourself. And I really like this other quote that he's referencing. He says again, Da said Prajapati, god of thunder, did you hear me? And the man answering said, thou hast said to us, Data, give the sacred text, meaning that men recognize each other by the gift of speech,
Mm-hmm.
right? The
Mm-hmm.
gift of speech. It's like, oh my God, Lacan, like this man was well read. Like,
This man was well read. I mean,
yeah,
I my jaw dropped when I read that
yeah,
passage the first
yeah.
time. You know, I mean, not only is it echoing, T.S. Eliot referencing this in the Wastelands, but it's much more than that. Like,
Mm,
this is Lacan's one of his great statements on what the actual function of speech is.
mhm,
At the level of the real. You
mhm.
know.
Yeah. Well, I also, and I played with this a lot, and maybe I should write something on this, but like it also makes me think of the one Zen koan. I forget the name of it, but he's like, it's the Zen master, and he's asking a student, what is the sound of the Buddha? And he just gives the hand. Tell me, what is the sound of the origin of the universe? And he just raises his hand like that. So these sort of like weird responses, it's like these are just pure indexicals, right? But then like, what is being referred to, what is touched upon the level of the real from answering the question, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
these primordial origins, or about like this search for truth and enlightenment. All you're receiving are these things, and then like further questions, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, and the beauty of the koan also is that it doesn't even attempt to symbolize the truth
Mm-hmm.
that it's pointing to. It allows for the real to remain in the domain that it exists in, which is beyond symbolization. So you can only point,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
There's only pointing. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think that Lacan's entire concept of psychoanalytic experience, which is the last line of the title of the mirror stage, right? The mirror stage as formative of the I function, as revealed in psychoanalytic experience, this is very profound, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, we literally just like, went through this entire essay and even more in just like a short period of time. This was like really great. I don't really have anything else to add if you have anything more
I
than that.
know. I think that's a good
That
place to conclude.
yeah, no, definitely. We definitely have to do something else on another Cree essay, or maybe like something related to psychoanalysis in the future. This is really fun. Um,
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, thank you again, and yeah, thanks again for coming on. This was great, and thank you all for tuning in. And I know like I don't really have that many viewers, but those that do follow the channel, I've received really great feedback, and it's wonderful because it's like not just following for the sake of like the algorithm, but like people that are really interested, that are barred from the university, or that are really trying to understand the stuff. And it's just like it's too hard for me. Like I don't know where to begin, and I've been getting really great responses and feedback regarding like the way that I do my best to articulate this, at least as I try to, regarding this material, because it's really really tough. It's like I guess it's like also like with I don't know if you agree with this, but it's like what Albert Einstein says. It's like not one thing to like just know, but to know it is to be able to like break it down in like layman's terms, or just be able to break it down in simplified form. It's
Definitely.
like the most difficult thing to do. Like,
Right.
yeah,
Right. That's the gift of speech, is to
yeah,
be able to give that articulation, to
yeah,
enunciate, in a
yeah.
way that actually communicates.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, like I said, definitely have to do this again. And thank you all. Thanks for joining and tuning in. Stay tuned for the next Ecri reading.